And here's Holly. All right, we should be good to go, right? Can I just check maybe someone in the chat? Is anyone on? If you are online, can you confirm you can hear us? Yeah. Okay, sorry for that interruption.
No worries, it's fine.
Audio wasn't on.
No worries at all. Oh, and so, yeah, as a forestry professor, and I teach mineralogy and education, and I like to think about trees as habitat for pollinators because I feel like that's not talked about very much. So that's going to be my focus, not to ignore all the lovely ephemerals and things that I wish would come up right now, really, but to kind of maybe talk about some groups that aren't talked about very often. And I don't think for all of you, I really need to emphasize the importance of pollinators, but I will go kind of into some of those things. But I think everyone here is likely aware of how important they are and how much of a big impact we can make individually on providing pollinator habitat, supporting pollinators in our yards and our gardens and our environment. Both managed bees like honeybees and also all of our native bees, all of those are in decline, right? So anything that we can do will make a positive difference. So I hope we all feel really empowered to do that. And we all can really make a big difference in that. Oops. Okay. So just some numbers, because I like numbers, and to really emphasize how important pollinators are. Most of our flowering plants actually require a pollinator to move pollen from one plant to another, to allow plants to produce seeds and to flourish and to create genetic diversity, which strengthens those plants, right? So insects play a really important role, and so do birds. Okay, I'll just say there are birds, obviously, they're pollinators too. I know you're all thinking about birds. And I like birds too. But I guess my interest here is really supporting some of these insects and plants that require those pollinators to move pollen, right? That they can't self-pollinate. Some plants can self-pollinate. Most of our plants cannot do that. And some plants require very, very specific pollinators. And I think those are very cool. And some are just more general and will accept anybody that wants to move the pollen from one plant to another. But really a majority of our flowering plants do require some insect to move that pollen from plant to plant. A lot of the delicious things that we like to eat require insects to pollinate, or some of them, even if they don't require it, they certainly benefit in terms of improved seed set. So insects are an important part of our food systems. And I say this partially because I like to think about all the things that we like to eat and that we can grow that require insects as pollinators, but also in a sense that providing habitat is one thing, and making sure that we're not doing anything that can negatively impact the pollinators that need to be visiting these plants, if that makes sense. As a professional, worked a lot with fruit growers, commercial fruit growers, and there's a lot of insects and diseases that impact fruits, right, and other plants that we like to eat the fruit from. And so sometimes this is a conflict, right, where we want to have fruits that are delicious, obviously, and also that look really nice, right? You can't sell an apple that it's kind of rotten. I mean, maybe some of us would buy it. I would buy apples from you, Eric, and Sue, that have a little bit of rotten spots on them. But most of us, right, most people don't want to eat fruit that doesn't look good. And so to get perfect fruit, or to get fruit that is in good condition, sometimes we may need to control some of these insects and diseases. And we want to make sure that we can, do that, but be mindful that we need these insects around to do pollination as well, right? Not all insects are pests, and we need to make sure that the way that we're managing these promotes the insects that are needed in those systems. Yes, I'll just say that. Here, so I have some birds here, okay, and thinking about how important pollinators are to produce food for birds as well, so not just for us, right? A lot of the birds that we like to enjoy and provide habitat for need those pollinators so those plants can produce those seeds and those plants can regenerate. So I think about that quite a bit too. And so, yeah, and a lot of birds eat insects, right? So pollinators can be food sources for some of our wonderful birds as well. All right, I'm going to focus on bees. This is my group of most interest to me, because bees, when we're talking about pollination, bees are definitely the most important, most efficient, and kind of just the pollinators that really need to be there. And there's a number of reasons for this. And I guess maybe the number one thing is that bees need pollen to survive. Bees, this female halictid bee here is going to bring that pollen back to her babies and feed it to them. So bees eat pollen, and they require pollen for development through their life stages. A lot of other insects get pollen on them and visit flowers for maybe their nectar, right? Bees also enjoy nectar, it's sweet and it's good. But bees are the main insects that require pollen to complete their life cycle, basically. So they're very invested in that pollen. They need that pollen. It's not just an afterthought or something they accidentally brush up against when they're really trying to get in there and get the nectar from the plants. And many of the insects, you can see here, these are called corbiculas. I love that term, but it's a pollen basket. And a lot of bees have these on various parts of their legs and bodies. I'll show you some other pictures, specifically to hold pollen and then transport it back to their nests. And the other thing about this is that bees are very loyal to different plants that they will visit. And so for this, maybe echinacea coneflower, looks like, for this plant to be effectively pollinated, it needs pollen from one of the same plant to go to another one, and bees do that. We call that flower constancy in my world. So they will visit from one coneflower to another coneflower to another coneflower, or one apple blossom to another apple blossom to another apple blossom. So they will regularly do that, and that's what needs to happen, right, for plants to be pollinated. They need pollen from another individual in their same species. And bees do that. And a lot of other insects don't. They just kind of wander around and not as direct from one plant to another that needs that pollen. And so in that way, bees serve this really important role for plants, and they benefit from that as well. And like I said, some plants have very, very specific pollinators that they need, a specific species of bee to pollinate, and others just can enjoy any bee that happens to come by. And there are certain, I would say, characteristics of plants that some bees are going to cue into in terms of, say, bright white colors, or even the guides to show them where the nectar is. But a lot of bees, especially our native bees, are actually generalists, and will just kind of visit whatever is blooming at that time. So I like to show this slide here because bees collect pollen in different places. And these are some of our native bees. I am focusing, I guess, on native bees. Maybe I should have said that. So honeybees are awesome, but they're not native here. We raise them for honey and enjoy that, but I'm going to focus on our native bees, primarily ground nesting, sometimes in the soil, sometimes underneath leaf litter, but that's where a lot of our native bees are living. And these are just some of the families and names of bees, but some bees will, here I can point at this here, collect pollen on the underside here, and you might notice a theme that these are all quite hairy. Right? And so a lot of times they also will collect pollen and they're really stiff, dense hairs. So lots of bees will just collect it on the underside of their abdomen, just like this one here. But these are my favorite ones that collect it on their legs or their clavicula. So lots of these, and you can see these, you know, really obviously when you see bees, they just stand out. Their legs are, their pollen sacs are full. And then some bees though, don't have any pollen sacs. So cuckoo bees, these are just like cuckoo birds. And so they're nest parasites and they don't need pollen, don't collect pollen. So they don't have any place to put pollen. And they don't even have hairs on them usually. So they're kind of they're very cool. Maybe not if you're a bee that's being parasitized, whose nest is parasitized, but they're, I think, pretty interesting in the world of just diversity. But yeah, they don't require pollen and don't feed their nests, or, you know, they parasitize other nests and that's what they're interested in. So they don't have anywhere to collect pollen. Okay, so here's, this is gonna get you ready for your quiz, okay? So we are gonna talk about bee identification. We're not gonna identify all the different families of bees, but just general bee characteristics. So one of the things that, that many bees, not all, but many of our bees have, like I mentioned, is this really dense hairs here and all over the body. And so sometimes they're a little bit more just on the abdomen or just on the thorax here, or sometimes they're all over the place. But a lot of times these are not just identification characteristics in terms of helping us understand what is a bee and what's not, but they use them. You can see here, this bee has pollen all over itself. So these hairs help them to collect pollen, right? And so insects that are not interested or I would say not interested in pollen, but don't need pollen, often won't have hairs on them. So that's one thing to look for. There are always exceptions in the insect world, right? So there are some bees that don't have dense hairs, but that's one thing to look for. Also, so bees have 4 wings here, okay? And that is contrasted to flies that only have 2 wings. And so you've really got to watch out for those flies because they mimic lots of things. They're kind of the tricksters of the insect world. That's how I think of them anyway. So there's a lot of flies out there. Some of them are hairy, so you got to watch out, but they only have 2 wings. Flies have 2 wings. All the rest of insects have 4. So it's hard to count them when they're flying around, obviously, but if you get a good look at them, you can see, are you a bee? Are you a fly? Or are you something else? Trying to count the wings. And then a lot of bees, you can see down here, have antennae that are elbowed or bent. So that's another thing to look for. So I don't know how well you can see that, but a lot of these have it. Again, not all, but a lot of them have this elbowed antennae here, big compound eyes. And then a lot of them have these little false eyes that they can use to sense movement and shadows and things like that. So a lot of them have that on the top of their head as well. So those are, I guess, generally bee characteristics. And I will also say within the bee category, bumblebees get a lot of press, right? Lots of people like to, talk about bumblebees, and they are an easy target because they're just kind of cute, right? They get a lot of people's attention. They're relatively easy to identify. I mean, I've done enough surveys where I can identify a lot of bumblebees, 2 species, just by looking at them on a flower, which most insects are really hard to get to species level just by looking at them. And certainly the other bees, you really can't do that. And so bumblebees are really awesome. I don't have to collect them and kill them to then look at them under a microscope and identify them, if that makes sense. Because a lot of bees, you do need to do that. But the bumblebees, you don't have to do that. You can just look at them, which is awesome. But anyway, this is meant to just show the vast diversity of bees out there. And most of them are not bumblebees or honeybees. Honeybees, there's just 1 species of honeybee. And that we have, yeah, kind of crazy, right? And we see honeybees, but they're all the same. And so in Wisconsin, we've got about 20 species of bumblebees. 20 is really generous. if I'm out there surveying, I see maybe 5 or 6 that are very common species of bumblebees. But there's, thousands of species of bees in, not just in Wisconsin. There's maybe 400, or I don't know, we don't know exactly, but anyway, there's several hundred in Wisconsin that we know of. But there's a whole lot that are out there, and they're different kinds of bees that are not bumblebees or honeybees. So one thing I'd like you to take away from this, just as in terms of like, oh, this is so cool, there's so many different types of bees. These are all families, all right, families of bees. But this is one thing I wanted to focus on. So up here, this is from University of Minnesota. They do all kinds of cool bee stuff. So that's a good resource. But anyway, this little box up here on the top. So some of our native bees are social and some are solitary. Some are ground nesting or cavity nesting. And then, like I said, the cuckoo bees are nest parasites. And so all these little symbols kind of explain what these are. And within each group, like within the halictids, which are mostly your metallic green bees, okay? Some of them are solitary, some of them are social. Some of them are ground nesting, some are cavity nesting, right? But so there's a real diversity in the native bee population in terms of what they do and how they interact with one another. Most of them have 1-year life cycles, meaning that they start over every year. So this time of year, the queens that were mated last fall are going to be laying their eggs, and then they're going to be looking for something to feed their babies, right? And so this is maybe the most critical time of year, kind of for all of us. I think about this for us too, right? Like we're ready for some new things, right? We've been eating potatoes and other stored stuff all winter, and we're ready for new food, but those bees need food right now. And so this early spring is critical for all these that need to feed their young right now. So anyway, just pretty awesome in terms of diversity. I am in awe of this. Okay. Other animal pollinators are also very cool. I don't want to discount them, especially butterflies, right? Everybody loves butterflies. They're beautiful, right? And they can be pollinators, but anyone know what kind of mouth parts butterflies have?
Sucking.
Yeah, a proboscis, right? It's a sucking mouth part. They just are in it for the nectar. They just want nectar. That's all they can eat. They can't chew anything, right? They're just sucking up that nectar. Okay, so they're not really in it for the pollen is what I'm meaning here. They can pollinate, they like accidentally brush up against something and maybe brush up against something else and make that pollination happen, but they're not reliable. Okay, never rely on a beautiful butterfly to do your pollination. Okay, you really need a bee to do this. So I just like to say this because people, I mean, there's butterfly gardens and everyone loves these. Okay, but when we're really talking about pollination, they're not the ones that are doing it. They serve plenty of other roles. And I also like to remind everyone, when you're planting plants to attract butterflies and some other cool moths, what are their immatures and what do they do? What's an immature butterfly?
Caterpillar.
Yeah, what do they eat? Plants, leaves, yeah, right. So like you gotta tolerate them eating the plants that you've planted. So you don't really think about that because you're like, I want that, which is so beautiful. I do want that also, but then its immature is gonna be eating my parsley. And I'm not gonna be that excited about that. Okay, so anyway, we just have to think about that. But there's a lot of other pollinators. All right, so this is a friend, this is a mimic here. This is a fly that wants you to think that it's a bee. So you got it, like I said, you gotta watch out for those flies. These are actually predatory as immatures. And so they eat aphids and things like that when they're immature flies. The adults don't eat very much, but they can eat some random things. They will eat some pollen. They'll cut through a plant and sip out the nectar and they have like a sponge mouth part. So as an adult, So they'll kind of sponge stuff. But anyway, these are very cool, and these are related to, you might be familiar with like hover flies or flies that they kind of, yeah, hover around you and they land on you and they have their little mouth part that they're sucking up sweat or something. So not really pollinators, but they're on flowers, and they want you to think that they're bees. They want you to be afraid of them, but you don't need to be afraid of them. Okay, there's beetles that are also on flowers, and these beetles, these adults live in trees. The immatures live in trees, and the adults feed on flowers and feed on other plant parts. So they're not doing too much pollination, but they're around, and they're pretty cool. Oh, let me go back to my fly here. I didn't say this. So flies, as I said, only have 2 wings, right? If you really get to look at them closely, you can see these little yellow knobby things. So these, maybe millions of years ago, were wings. And they've evolved to be, we call these halteres. So these aren't important for balance. They actually need them. But so the flies need them, but they don't serve a flying purpose anymore. And so if you can see that there's 2 wings, 2 membranous wings, and then these little halteres, then you know you have a fly, for sure. Okay, it's like the only guarantee. Big compound eyes here, and then flies often will have much shorter antennae than bees. And typically not hairy, but like I said, there are definitely some hairy flies out there. Okay, so beetles, one way to identify beetles, their wings are hard on the outside for protection, and then their wings come together in the middle. So you can see this line down the middle, that's just their front wings kind of side by side. So if you see that line down the middle, you know you've got a beetle. These have really long antennae. These are longhorn beetles, but not all beetles have super long antennae. And mostly not hairy. Probably see this and are scared of it because you should be. So there's lots of wasps out there that are on flowers, and those are predatory, right? So they're going to be eating insects that are on flowers, and they have that bright yellow and black coloration that many things like to mimic. So these may do a little pollination, but that's not what they're there for, right? They're really there to get a meal from another insect. These wasps, all wasps have 4 wings. I know it's kind of hard to see here. And then they usually have that thin waist. They call that the wasp waist, right? Really thin waist between the thorax and the abdomen. So if you see that thin waist, then it's probably a wasp. Bees don't have that thin waist between their thorax and the abdomen. And then there's the cool hummingbird moths, right? And actual hummingbirds. And so these, again, just the same as butterflies, have that proboscis or that straw-like mouth part. So they're just in for the nectar. So don't do a ton of pollinating, but are so cool. Just the coolest things. I don't know about you. You're all, way more into birds than me, but I get surprised all the time. It takes me a while to look at them and see if it's a moth or a hummingbird. They look so similar, which is so cool. Okay, so now we're ready for the quiz. Are you ready for your quiz? Okay, so we're gonna have pictures of insects, and you're gonna tell me if it's a bee or not a bee, all right? Bee or not a bee? Bee. Absolutely, very good. So this is a halictid bee. Which is a just little, metallic green bee, and you can see all the pollen all over it, very hairy. These do have a thinner waist between the thorax and the abdomen, and I can assure you there's 4 wings here, longer antennae, but yeah, just the fact that the coloration and the pollen all over it. Could be a male, so the females are the only ones that collect pollen. Males do not collect pollen. So corbicula are only on females, actually. So if you see a bee with those big stuffed sacs, that's a female. And males don't have them. So that can be a little bit challenging sometimes too, because the males and females can often look different.
It's usually really small too.
Sorry?
Small compared to.
The males?
No,
Oh,
all the halictids are quite small.
Yes, yeah, halictids are very small. I cannot identify them to species level just from just from them being on the plant. So those, if I want them to species level, then I need to collect them. Yeah.
So they're collecting pollen and they're eating pollen when they're on the flower, both?
Mhm.
And when they collect it, do they just kind of wrap around and it sticks to them, or do they like actually take pollen and put it in their little sacks?
They actually take it and put it in their sacks.
With what?
With their other legs.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Huh. And they're not really going around to pollinate other things, they're just going there to collect more pollen.
Well, they do in that process, they do collect pollen from multiple plants. So that there has been studies done to show, like, for example, how much are bees pollinating if are they visiting just one flower and filling up and then going right back to their nest? Or are they going to multiple flowers and then going back to the nest? And so they go to multiple flowers. So they don't fill up their pollen sacs just on one plant, which is how they're able to pollinate. Because yeah, if they just went to one flower and then just brought it all back, then that wouldn't serve any role, right? So yeah, they instead of all and just visiting one, they visit multiple ones. So that's how that pollen is transferred.
And is it transferred because, like, you know, they're romping around and they have it all over their body, or do they actually take it out and?
No, that the transfer is just because it's all over.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they collect some, but then get some all over them, and that's the stuff that pollinates the other plants. Yeah, that's a good question. So they're not actually, I've done a good amount of hand pollinating myself on certain things, and so they're not like taking it from one plant and physically putting it on the other, but that's where the hairs come in. So that's enough apparently to serve that role. Yeah, good, really good question. Okay, this is a tricky one.
Fly. It's short.
Do I have a consensus?
It's not a bee.
How many wings does it have?
Oh, yeah.
It's a hairy
So tricky, right? Yeah, it's got all the things, right? This one is really a good mimic. So this is called a robber fly. These are very cool flies. And these are big flies, very big. So these are as big as or even bigger sometimes than the biggest bumblebees that we have. So these are big flies and they're predators. So that's why they're called robber flies. And I've seen robber flies carrying whole adult cicadas before away. Yeah, so they're serious. Okay. But they don't bother us at all. They are not interested in us in any way. But they do have all the characteristics that you would say, oh yeah, it's a bee for sure. They've got the hair. All robber flies are quite hairy, and they have these, I like to think of these like beards, these long hairs on the front of their body or their head. I'm not exactly sure what that serves, but yes, you can see these are the halteres right here. But so it's two wings, and then these have what's the word I'm looking for? But abnormally long abdomen. So their abdomens are much longer than most other flies. I don't know why. That's just a characteristic of robber flies. They have very long abdomens.
What do they kill with?
Their mouths. Yeah, so you can see its mouth here. They like pierce it, and then they have kind of like a similar mouth part to a horsefly. They kind of pierce through, and then they have some mandibles in there too that chew up things. It's kind of gory, actually. But luckily they don't bother us at all. Okay. Yeah, bee or not bee? It's a bee. Yeah, this is a bee. Pretty standard bee. Okay. What do you got here?
Bee.
Yeah, this is a bee too. Yeah, this is a bumblebee, probably eastern common bumblebee. Very good. What do we have?
It's a beetle.
Yeah, it is a beetle. Yeah, so pretty hairy, right? But you can see, hopefully the wings come together here. Very tricky. So this one, and then this, okay, this one's called a flower beetle. I don't know. I don't common names are sometimes terrible for insects. So it's called flower beetles. They're found on flowers. And this one also has clubbed antennae. I don't know how well you can see that, but a lot of beetles will have clubs. They're just like balls on the ends of their antennae of some beetle families. So these ones mostly eat plants. They eat the leaves, they eat the flowers, they eat all parts of the plant. So you see them a lot on plants. I think this might be the last one. Yeah, this is another tricky one, but fly very short antennae. And so even though it's hairy and it does have two wings only, two membranous wings, you maybe see the halteres in here. But this is called a bee fly. I'm not joking. So, again, who makes these common names? They're not helpful. But yeah, and so these eat the flowers and the leaves and stuff too.
So,
Yes.
Holly, would these be all critters that we would see in our, around here? Like, so we could see bee flies like in
Yes.
a couple of weeks around, okay, cool.
Yeah, all of these are things you would see. Even the robber flies and yeah, these are all flower beetles, definitely. Yep. Okay, there's no way I'm gonna get to all this now that I'm seeing what time it is. So I'll try to, I guess, I'll say some more things and that'll be it. I guess I do want to get to specific plants. But here are, I guess, some other things. So that you've passed your quiz. Very good. Thanks for participating. That's really fun for me. I love doing stuff like that. There's a lot of cool insects out there. But anyway, okay, so when we're talking about, you know, maybe you're thinking, oh, well, I didn't realize that trees could be so, you know, such good pollinator habitat. Maybe I want to plant some trees for bees. Okay, so that's where this is kind of coming into taking into consideration some things that you can think about. As I mentioned, there's tons of, it's a lot of diseases, but some insects too that are very prevalent on our fruit trees and other trees that could be great bee habitat. So one way to avoid, you know, feeling like you need to spray something because you don't want those pests on there is to buy resistant cultivars or varieties of plants that are resistant. And again, these are usually disease resistant, but there are some that are insect that are not as attracted to insects. And so this can help you have both. You can have pollinator habitat and also not have a lot of pests on your fruit, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of options for all the different types of fruit that are out there, and other plants too, not just fruit trees, but a lot of fruit trees serve as really great pollinator habitat and really good food for us. Right? So I tend to think about those a lot. Sanitation for diseases, especially so cleaning up diseased fruit, fallen fruit that has insects in it and diseases. So in the fall, if you have stuff that's fallen that wasn't fully ripe because a disease or insect got in there, if you remove that, then you're gonna have a lot fewer problems the next year. And so that can really, again, I guess these are just strategies to think about, like, so we're not having to spray. What else can you do to provide habitat? Other cultural practices like removing fruit, anytime you notice fruit that has insects or diseases in it, removing that, or removing branches that have obvious damage on them to just try to reduce the overall insect and disease populations there. Increasing airflow decreases diseases, especially things like bacteria and fungi that like moisture. Right, so not planting things too close together, keeping an open crown, and just as much as we can be watching our plants during the growing season so we can catch these things as early as possible. It's so hard to do, okay? I'm saying this as if like, and you can just sit around and watch your plants. I wish, right? And we all probably wish we could do that, but I mean, the sooner you catch things, then the sooner you're able to have an impact in terms of reducing and removing these things. So chemical applications are, I mean, again, I worked a lot with commercial growers, and it's kind of a, you know, sometimes a thing that people feel necessary to use. Avoiding this time of year as much as possible. when a lot of times our fruit trees in the early spring or even mid-spring are some of the only things that are flowering. And so all the pollinators are gonna be on those plants. And so later on in the season, it's less of there's more choices, I guess, in terms of what insects can use. But this time of year, if we can avoid spraying things that are harmful to bees, we're going to have a much bigger impact. Whereas later, yes, when, there's a lot more other things for the bees to be foraging on. I'm gonna skip this. This is maybe we talk about growing zones. You might be familiar with this when we're talking about vegetables to grow. I use this a lot when I'm talking about plant hardiness and trees. And your trees are gonna be a lot happier and healthier if they're planted in the appropriate zone. So some of us like to test things or like just try to plant something that would rather be in a little warmer climate, but we want to try to grow peaches or something, right? Yeah.
How often are those zone maps updated?
That's a great question. This was updated as of fall last year.
Andy's got.
Yeah, so every 15 years approximately they're updated. So this map is the fall 2024 map that took into account the previous 15 years of data. And so, and that is cool. I don't have that in this slideshow, but in my classes, that is something that I show the changes over time, and they're real in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
These maps have changed several times, right? So this isn't and I use it as an example of like things are changing right now, right? And they have been changing over our lifetime. It's not something that is still in the future. And yeah, we've gone in Wisconsin, we've lost a couple of growing zones, and we've added a couple of growing zones over the last even couple of decades. Okay, so we have new warmer growing zones. Even in this map, the city of Stevens Point is now in growing zone 5A, and that's new. Yeah, we've upgraded, right? Just kind of scary, but then you're like, well, I could plant these other things, maybe. So you can maybe take advantage of the warmer microclimate in the city of Stevens Point. But yeah, it was the first year where Stevens Point was in 5A. And then in Milwaukee area, it was upgraded to 6A, I think. Anyway, whatever the area right around the southeast part was upgraded also to a new growing zone, this last map. And we've pretty much gotten rid of zone 3 in Wisconsin. It just doesn't get that cold anymore. So this is something that is updated and changes over time. And we can use it to our benefit to kind of, again, plant some things that maybe we couldn't plant a couple decades ago. But when I think about planting, I think about planting trees that are adapted to our region so that they're going to be healthy and less susceptible to insects and diseases. I guess, so that's getting a little bit outside of pollinators, but if you're going to plant a plant, if you plant something that is adapted to our growing conditions, it's going to have fewer problems in the future, generally. All right, so some of the things I think specifically about, Susan, cut me off anytime you need to. I don't even know where Susan is, but I can be cut off at any time. But some plants need multiples. And one thing I really want to talk about is having overlapping blooming dates. So if you are thinking about planting plants, the best thing you can do for pollinators is have a consistent supply of pollen throughout the whole growing season, from the very early till the latest possible. That will allow pollinators to stay where they are in your habitat, wherever you're creating. If there's a gap in pollen, a gap in flowers, they will leave. And so really thinking about plants that provide that consistent pollen source as much as possible. So when you're thinking about when plants are flowering, having things that flower very early, mid, and late season all throughout that time is one of the most important things we can do, and maybe one of the most important messages I'd like to leave you with. So that's that, I guess that's one message. Those red and silver maples that are flowering right now, I mean, I love them so much because they're like first things that are flowering, but those are important sources of pollen for bees. And there are, I've seen some bees already out on the maples at my farm. So all of those, so everything that's flowering right now is, there's not a ton of insects that have emerged. It's pretty darn cold, right, still. But there are, those flowers do provide really important early season habitat. Service berries are starting to pop, not quite redbud yet here. Hazelnuts are starting to open up, prunises, cherries, and plums, and those are usually like the first big flush. But the maples are usually the first things that start. Our buckeyes and things that we've been planting a lot of these are not really native in outside of the planting area here. But lots of our other fruit trees fill that mid-spring category, and then, you know, once you hit this, you get tons of things. One of my favorite trees, bee trees, is all of our tilia, our basswoods and lindens. Those are fabulous bee trees. And if you have those, you will find so many bees. Like, it's just, I love watching the bees on the basswoods. So anyway, this is probably the most critical time. Once you start getting, you know, later in the growing season, there's plenty of other things. I love watching bees on the catalpas too. And then witch hazel is mostly pollinated by flies, but lots of other things can use it. And I love witch hazel so much because it's the only thing flowering in October, and it brightens everything up. It's got those cool bright yellow flowers, and nothing else is flowering in October. So I love witch hazel. And so there are some, by then the insects are starting to go into their winter mode as well, but there are a lot of insects that will utilize witch hazel. So those are just, I could have put a million things on here, but those are just some of my favorite ones. I'm not gonna go there. Okay, and then I guess maybe the last thing is this time of year, we really want to get into our gardens and get them ready, right? But a lot of our native bees are nesting, could be in those leaves, and are going to start to emerge. And we want to really try as much as possible to leave those areas, leave leaves that have been there all winter. I know we want to so much clean up our stuff. But right now is a really critical time for bees in particular, because a lot of bees will be nesting in that leaf litter that was left there, in your gardens or in your mulch. We talk about no mow May, and that's really important too, to just try to leave our manicured spaces a little more unmanicured for a little bit of time. But this can really provide a lot of habitat if we just let things be at this time of year.
Is there a way to encourage the village and of Plover and the city of Stevens Point to stop the collection of all the brush and the grass so early so that this could happen and people wouldn't feel compelled? Is there been any effort, any ideas on how to approach these government bodies to say, hey, wait a minute?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, about the leaf collection and brush collection and
It's
things
going
like
on
that.
right now.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of piles out on the roads. Stevens Point in particular, has a really big group of interested folks that I guess the first wave was kind of those participating in No Mow May, but now are really interested in, they have a Lawns Gone Native program that you might have heard of, where they're promoting native plantings, and they're no longer giving people citations for not mowing or for, not having a manicured lawn. I don't know about Plover specifically, but within the city of Stevens Point, there are folks that are working for the city that are promoting those programs and working with landowners. And so that group, I think, could be one that could help with that. And I am in communication, so I guess I'll leave you with one of the things that I'm doing is, and several of you are involved with this project, but I am doing some pollinator surveys in people's yards. I did this throughout the summer, last summer, to try to get an understanding of really what is around, because the information is pretty lacking for native bees. You know, the insects just in general don't gather that much support and whatever in general, but pollinators now are something that people are paying attention to. And I'd like to have an understanding of, you know, if you do this in your yard, like what could you be promoting? What could you be providing habitat for? Some specifics instead of just saying pollinators, like do this and you'll have pollinators. Well, I really want to know what's utilizing those spaces. And so I'm going to be continuing that this summer. And yeah, so I'm connected with the city in that regard. I asked the city for folks that might be interested, and they gave me this huge list, literally of hundreds of people. This is just me, so I can't do the survey on everybody's yard. But there are so many people in the city of Stevens Point that are excited about participating in this. In my study, and just the lawns gone native and providing native habitat for native plants and other habitat for pollinators. So that was really encouraging to me. And the fact that the city had people that were working on that was also a good sign. So I think that group, I could certainly talk to that group and see if they could kind of extend their messaging to include this and see if the city we could encourage this more, because it really will make a big difference for sure. Yeah. Jen?
As far as leaving the leaves and other debris from perennial garden or perennial beds and things like that that we have, is there a certain temperature or something that triggers the bees to hatch? And then after that, we would be like, okay, we're good now. Now we can go in and work in our gardens because we know these insects have hatched and fulfilled that life cycle.
Sure, usually consistent 50 degrees and above is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, not hardly any activity. So once temperatures are consistently over 50, not necessarily at night, I mean, it can get cold at night, but they're consistently warm over usually maybe for a couple of weeks at least. That's when you're going to see things really starting to happen. So right now would be a time to not do anything yet. We haven't quite hit that point, right? It's still somehow, but it'll get there. So yeah, usually by mid-May, everything's, you know, moved on. And sometimes it is earlier. I guess sometimes it is a little bit later too. But yeah, 50 degrees is usually the threshold for most insects in general, but it seems to be for a lot of our ground nesting bees for them to become active. And so you need that for at least a couple of weeks for them to get themselves established, and then you'd be okay.
How can you detect where the ground nesting solitary bees are, like the leaf cutter bees and the sweat bees, and how could we provide or not destroy areas that they're nesting in?
That is a really great question. It's incredibly challenging to find these. I've been out a couple of times with folks from University of Minnesota that's their job, is to go out at this time of year or a little bit later in spring and look for different bee nests. And honestly, I feel like if you pretend you're not looking for them, then you find more than, you know. For example, one time we found a bumblebee nest when we had kind of stopped doing what we were doing, and we were working with this, we were digging a soil pit for a different project, and then we found this nest. So it is very, very challenging. We know so little, honestly, about the habits of, and we know more about bumblebees than we do about the solitary bees. we just know so little about how to find them. There really is no, I can't say, like, this is what you can do, this is where to look. If you do come across any, that would be awesome information to let us, I mean, I'd say there are some folks in Madison that are working on bees, but the bee lab in Minnesota is the most active as far as I know. They have the biggest staff that are trying to document life cycles and where things are nesting. So that would be awesome information. So yeah, we talk a lot about generally where they might be underneath leaf litter in undisturbed areas, so areas that were not disturbed in fall, for example. But there's really no exact, we just know so little, can't say, unfortunately. But if you do come across any, that's really valuable information.
Do they come back to the same locations?
No.
Or, so they're gonna be moving?
Well, because for example, the females that were bred in the fall, they're only going to live until the next fall, and then
So they
there's no.
don't use like the old queen's nests or anything like that?
Right, they do often use, that's a good point, so they don't necessarily, use the same place where they were raised, for example, but they use like small mammal holes, and the other critter holes, other little critters. I know that's not a technical term, sorry. But definitely, but yeah, definitely they have, especially the bumblebees have been found in little ground, in whole other things that have been used by mammals, especially not necessarily by other bees. So that is something, if you know of those areas, you might be able to find some bees in there. But yeah, I think that is a challenge, thinking about just where good habitat is. There's that carryover. There's not bees that live long enough to then show the next generation, if that makes sense. Whereas there's other insects and other groups of things that can share that information.
Do you have anything to say about bee houses, straw, like things?
Yeah, well, I don't have a lot to say. I just I've seen mixed results with those in terms of sometimes there's a lot of those on the market. I've just seen some research studies that kind of test, are these effective? And there's kind of a wide range of effectiveness or them being used. And just anecdotally, I've talked to tons of people that say, I have this bamboo house thing and nothing's ever colonized it. So I think part of it is just maybe, we don't have a perfect understanding of what might be useful and what might not be. I mean, those are based on what we know, right? I mean, those are created based on what we've seen insects using, but there's got to be other factors in there that we might not know about, exactly related to placement, related to where their pollen and nectar sources are, that kind of thing. So I don't think they hurt anything, but it's kind of disappointing if you put something up and it doesn't get used. And yeah, I'm thinking of this one study in particular that did have some recommendations, like if you wanted to buy these things, of course, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but if you contact me, I can share that with you. But there are some of those houses that seem to be more often used than others. And so I would just have to pull that out. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of people out there trying, right? I mean, that's the positive thing out of all of this, is that there is so much interest in pollinators as a whole. And I think as we all learn more about bees and their importance, we all want to do something. And so there's a lot of efforts that are happening, but it's hard to know what the impact is. There's so few people doing research on this. And so I'm trying to do a little bit, but yeah, the amount that we know is so little compared to what we really need to know to, you know, to answer some of the questions.
I have another question. We recently burned our small prairie. Is that a big problem for the bees? If they're in there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It depends it sort of depends. So generally, you might have disturbed some insects if they were overwintering in some of that prairie area. Oftentimes, there is enough refugia around, depending on the acreage, but even if you're burning several acres, there's often, the insects can actually move. If they have senses for smoke, so the smoke is what alerts them and they can move. There are efforts, there are research projects going on looking at the impacts of burning on pollinators, and primarily it's very positive, right? I mean, in terms of the amount of habitat that it creates. And it doesn't seem to have negative impacts in the springtime, but there is a group looking at summer burning. And from my standpoint, I think about summer, wow, well, that's gotta be really hard, everything's green, right? But if you do a summer burn, you get a more or a less complete burn, and therefore more refugia for pollinators during that time. And so it may not achieve all of your goals in terms of having the whole area burned, but it might be more friendly to pollinators, if that makes sense. But I think that part of it is we just don't know, like there's not been that much research to show what is there before the burn, what is there after the burn. Does that make sense? In my mind, that's kind of what we need to know what the impact is. But from the little bit that has been done, burning is one of the best things that we can do to create habitat. Certainly insects the pollinators are responding to that increased habitat and utilizing it. But I am super interested in that summer burn thing and just the idea that we have, so in the summer, most of the bees they're done with their nests, they're out of their nests, and they have more places to go and avoid the burn, if that makes sense. So I'm really interested in that, and I'm lucky to have lots of people at the university that like to do burning, and so we're gonna try some of this. Lots of students and faculty, so we are gonna try some of that, probably up at Tree Haven at our field station near Rhinelander, try some of that and see what the impacts. So I'm excited about that. Yeah, that's a really great question.
You give a great list of trees throughout the seasons. And I wonder if you could just comment briefly on like shrubs or other plants that are not only native, but are especially useful for feeding the bees we want to be feeding.
Yeah, sure. And I can provide a more comprehensive list of even trees. I just threw a few on there to not be like have a million on there. I would say some of the hazelnuts, probably my favorite one for early. They provide some of the earliest habitat. They're some of the first ones to open up. I love hazelnut so much too. So that is one. I mean, serviceberry and its relatives can be shrubby or they could be tree-like, I guess, but they're a really early one too. The viburnums are awesome. And the viburnum, there's lots of different types of viburnum, but there's a lot that, again, if you really like viburnums, you can pick some that are flowering kind of throughout the season, if that makes sense. So those are some really great shrubs that I think of another one. So one thing kind of off of that is invasive things that we consider invasive plants, some of which provide pretty good bee habitat when they're there. But something that there's some researchers up north that talked about in a presentation that I was at that really got me thinking about this. Because I feel like as a community, we're pretty in tune with native and promoting native plants, and we're pretty enthusiastic sometimes about removing things that we consider invasive. But some areas are really maybe only full of invasive plants. And though if a place really is overtaken by invasive, the pollinators are utilizing those. And if we remove all of those at one time, we really can be reducing habitat for that period of time where, pollinators may have to leave because there's nothing to eat there. And I will say that was not something I ever really considered, because we're just in the habit of controlling things that we don't want, and that's just something that we do. But I also recognize that a lot of our invasive plants do get utilized by pollinators. I never really thought about controlling, if we are controlling invasives, just to make sure that we are also providing some habitat at the same time, or maybe not removing it all at once, or removing it once it's done flowering, or, something like that. So I don't know, just something that I hadn't really thought about that I'd like to share when we're thinking about shrubs and what to plant. Maybe we're removing some things to plant others, and really trying to provide as much as possible that continuous source of pollen as much as we can, even if it temporarily involves some plants that we wish weren't there. If that makes sense. Something to think about. But I'm happy to share some more plants that are not coming into my brain right now, but happy to share some resources. There's a lot of options, which I think is very cool too, because we all have different preferences and things, and plants serve a lot of different roles. So there's a lot of different options. Happy to share.
I have a question, Holly, from your slide where you were talking about the different fruit trees for both the bees and the people. You listed sanitation and you talked about like fallen fruit and that sort of thing. And of course, I always have that and I don't do much with it. What would be a good way to deal with that? Like, how far do you need to move the fruit away from the trees? Or is throwing it in a compost pile sufficient? Or
yeah, generally a compost pile will do it. I mean, if it is a compost pile that is not very active, it would be less effective, I guess, at killing things. So the hotter the compost, the more effective it would be. Insects are a little bit easier to kill compared to some of the fungal diseases that are quite persistent and able to survive. Some of the diseases will just die when say a branch or something dries out too. So I think the best, or one of the best options, is to put things in a compost pile and at least just turn it and make sure things aren't right at the surface. You can burn plant material, maybe not fruit, but yeah, you can burn material if you have a campfire or something, and that'll get rid of those things as well. And if you really, I mean, insects are very negatively impacted by smoke. So even if you did, for example, have a bunch of fallen fruit, you could put them like near your campfire, and that smoke might do the trick in terms of killing some of the pests that might be in there. We use that a lot as a way to kill insects that are in like cones of plants. So a fire underneath would kill a lot of those seed and cone insects that are in the canopy there. So they don't need the heat necessarily, and they don't need the fire to be burned, but they just, that smoke, and enough smoke will kill them. So that could be something that you could do, yeah.
So you said you might be able to share some of this information. How do we get a hold of you, or how do you?
Sure, yeah, I don't
something
know
out
if I
there.
have my contact info in here. I might, let's see, no, I don't, isn't that helpful? Sorry, let's see.
Holly, I bet you could share it with Susan, and then she could put it on the website.
Yeah,
Oh,
website.
That's helpful, okay, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I will definitely do that then. So then Susan can remind me to do that. But no, yeah, I'm happy to do that if that works. And then, oh, yeah, we're just talking about sharing some additional resources. And maybe just even my name, if my name was somewhere in those resources, you could me up at the university and send me an email too. That would work. I don't have my name anywhere.
Like I could put that in the YouTube description of like more information or links to resources.
Awesome.
Paired with this presentation, so.
Perfect, because yeah, I have even some in this PowerPoint. I have some resources here,
Okay.
but I have others that are more specific about woody plants that are good pollinator habitat. So yeah, I can definitely provide that. And yeah, I don't know why I didn't put my name anywhere in here, so. I guess, yeah, I'm talking, so that's my. And yeah, and you can just write holly.petrillo@uwsp is my email, so, but I can put it in that info too. Yeah, I love doing stuff like this and, interacting and talking about pollinators. Anytime, really. I love this topic and it's, yeah, very, very close to my heart, so.
As a purveyor of coffee, is coffee pollinated by insects?
It is.
You're the purveyor, not me.
It is pollinated by insects, yeah. Yeah, it's actually, I love, if anyone would ever be able to visit a coffee farm, and it's our springtime, so like right now, coffee is flowering. And it is full of bees, full. And it smells really, it's just got this intoxicating smell, beautiful white flowers. Yeah, I love flowering coffee. But yes, yeah, bee pollinated. So awesome. Yeah.
So just one other thing. So besides the trees for pollen, do the bees use trees like other species of trees for like nesting or shelter?
I'd say mostly not. Most of them are ground nesting, so in leaf litter or on the soil. There are some that would be in cavities. So if there were cavities in a branch or on the main stem of a tree, then some of them would utilize that habitat too. So similar to, yeah, like holes that birds might create or small mammals or something, some of the bees would utilize that. But yeah, otherwise, no, not a lot of nesting habitat yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you, Molly.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I know I've been talking for a long